So many questions, not enough time with both of you. Minister Leblanc, Bill C-26 does impose some significant requirements for cybersecurity for small and medium-sized Canadian businesses without really acknowledging that those requirements could be a lot more onerous than for smaller enterprises than for massive organizations. Yet today, and to follow up with what Senator Carignan was asking you, we see an alarming news article about a huge cyber attack on a branch of your government, the Canada Revenue Agency, with serious implications for Canadian taxpayers involving millions of dollars. But we also see in that report that Minister Bibeau was advised about that major cyber attack on Canada's Revenue Agency many months ago, and she was provided with media lines and messages for her to respond to any questions. But the article notes, quote, "In the end, the public was never alerted to the scheme," unquote. So, Minister Leblanc, why didn't your government tell Canadian taxpayers about this? And as public safety minister with responsibility for cybersecurity, were you also notified about this major cyber attack? And if so, why didn't you insist Canadians were told about it?
So, Senator, thank you for the question. You began talking, and I think I agree entirely that this legislation can't create an undue burden on small and medium-sized enterprises. We don't believe that's the case. It's intended to ensure that small businesses and all Canadians, for the reasons that François Philippe enunciated and others, can rely on some of these larger providers essential for their business activities. Only federally regulated operators who deliver services in the system, which would be vital to national security or public safety, like to Senator Couture's point, health, safety, security, economic well-being of Canadians would be captured. So I totally agree that we have to be careful not to create on small and medium-sized businesses that burden. Will be sensitive as the legislation, as the regulations are adopted, and as we look at the effects of some of these potential orders and so on, to be conscious of that. With respect to the breach, I personally was not aware of the circumstances that I read about publicly with respect to Revenue Canada until today. I'm told that the Revenue Agency would have perhaps talked to officials in our department, obviously the Cybersecurity Centre, and there's an important element of the Department of National Defence and the Communications Security Establishment, but I'm not aware of the details of how officials at Revenue Canada would have spoken to officials either in our department or at National Defence with respect to this breach. And as I said earlier, and as I say, so separate and apart from the specific circumstances at Revenue Canada that I'm not in a position to talk about, there is a balance, and I've seen this with provincial, municipal governments and talked informally with large private sector operators around the transparency of telling their shareholders, their partners, in the case of public governments, municipalities, or provinces and territories, their taxpayers, with preserving the confidence that people have in the system, or also not giving a roadmap for the next potential negative actor or hostile actor to identify a vulnerability until the vulnerability is fixed. So I've been in meetings where people say, this has happened to our province. We're not going to discuss it publicly until we've been able to build a backbone. That was the phrase I heard, to ensure that somebody won't come right in behind them. And then I think that particular provincial government talked about it publicly. That was just one circumstance I was in.
Well, I don't really understand how that applies here, given that the minister had lines ready to give. But Minister Leblanc, this bill has been a long time in coming, and the Trudeau government first held public consultations on it back in 2016. In 2018, your government released a national cybersecurity strategy, and it took another 4 years until 2022 for you to draft and introduce this bill in Parliament. Then it took 2 more years to work its way through the House of Commons, which included major amendments that at the committee stage, which basically overhauled this bill. And even after it does pass the Senate, it will take another 2 years in the regulatory phase before much of the impact of the legislation even comes into effect. So, Minister, all of this means that this cybersecurity bill will take your government a full decade to bring protections on this critical topic into effect. Why this extreme delay?
I'm going to ask the ministers to reflect on that because we've gone a minute over, so we'll go to Senator Dasco now, and if there's time, perhaps you could address that a little bit later, Senator Dasco.